this. We'll now hand over to our second speaker, Catherine from the Wellcome Sanger Institute, who will be talking about working towards a practical framework for the acquisition and use of non-human materials. Catherine, very glad you could be with us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Hopefully my screen is shared correctly.
Yes, we can see that just fine.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And firstly, I just wanted to say thank you for the invite to speak today. And I'd like to really take the opportunity to introduce the Sanger Institute, but in the context of being a user of animal materials and more widely non-human materials in research. So hopefully through this, I will describe a few of the methods that we use to assess the new materials that come into site, how we do this, the difficulties that we see with this and the challenges, and hopefully end with something that might work to help this in the future and might be of interest to some people on the call today. So we at the Sanger Institute are usually located in Hinxton, just a little bit south of Cambridge. I say usually because, of course, we're all working from home, I assume, at some point in the week. And we are a Wellcome funded organisation, but our researchers receive both a mix of core Wellcome funded pots, but also external grant funding, which is obviously quite relevant to the obligations that we are obliged to work under. So ultimately, we wish to deliver insights into human and pathogen biology, and to do that we use data, we use genetic sequence, genome sequences, and of course they come from the use of physical materials, both human but also non-human and animal. I think something that we do quite well at the Wellcome Sanger Institute is move with the times, and we move with the direction that the science goes. And so the most recent example of that comes in the form of our latest program, the Tree of Life program. So you'll see all of our 5 programs on this slide here. And this most recent program really echoes the growing concerns of biodiversity loss globally today. And this really is undertaking a huge project, the Darwin Tree of Life project, which aims to sequence all UK eukaryotic species. So you can imagine the upskilling that we was required in that area to come to get to grips with the regulations and review that you might need to do for that type of material. So that is quite relevant for our review. So I've grouped the types of material that we receive onto site into 2 broad categories. The first of which is the use of live animals in research, and the material and samples derived from the use of live animals in research. We've been really lucky on site for the past 10 years and more. We've had a research support facility that supported our science in producing model organisms, mainly rodent and aquatic models, and carried out work under ASPA for our researchers. This has been our primary source of the material then, as you can imagine. An on-site resource has been invaluable. This, however, is due to close mid this year, a decision that was taken a couple of years ago now, and it's just to mirror the way the science is going on site. So this primary source will shift. And we've already seen that. So over the last couple of years, we've seen a real increase in our off-site resources. And of course, they were always there, but as you can imagine, to a much lesser degree. So this is usually led by collaborators, partners, and they can be global, but also procured materials, so from commercial suppliers, commercial retailers, and also collections and more bespoke sources. So I've put a few examples here just to illustrate the range, even within this one category. And we do approach them a little bit differently. So for example, we would approach commissioned activities or service type work slightly differently to material that we receive as a byproduct. I use that term loosely, but byproduct of collaborator work under ASPA, for example. There's also difficulties in this area, historic samples that are generated potentially more than 10 years or more ago, and that's finding that information link and getting to the source of that material. So this has always been our secondary source, but it is definitely on the rise, and it will become our primary source for this type of material moving forward, really. So our second category is quite a large one, and it is animal-derived materials or animal materials from the use of materials, use of animals, sorry, outside of research. So this can range all the way from in situ collections, you know, and that's UK, EU, or even wider, all the way through to historical collections, museum collections, but also from across sector. So veterinary biopsies or veterinary practices, diagnostic samples, diagnostic services, all the way through to wildlife conservation, the agricultural sector, the food chain, which was mentioned in a question earlier. And we really do see this, especially now with the new programme on board as well. And this is also something that is relevant for all types of materials, from invertebrates all the way through to mammals and endangered species. So this is a real, hopefully, a picture of the type of things that we have seen and we are starting to see more of, and the range of provenances of material. So what we do at the Wellcome Sanger Institute is to, of course, review the use of all types of material that come onto site for our research. We do this both for human materials and equally for non-human materials. They are quite similarly regulated on different levels. So we do this both by doing an ethical review and a legal review. And as an institute, the purpose of this is to reduce, prevent where possible, but essentially to mitigate any risk that might be associated with getting this material on site and using it. And this is to protect both the institute, but also the research and the researchers themselves. But aside from that, we do this to promote high welfare standards across the sector, to raise awareness of the type of consideration that we do when looking at animal materials and where they come from. And of course, to support and promote providers in the transparency of the information that we look for and request when we do this type of review. So essentially, for each type of material that comes onto site, we carry out appropriate due diligence, and we want to evidence that due diligence. So we do this through a number of different ways. Internally we have AWERB. I'm sure everybody's familiar with AWERB, the Animal Welfare and Ethical Review body that's under establishments under ASPA. And so obviously that has a lot of expertise that we can tap into here. But also we use national legislation, so ASPA itself, but also those outside of the use of animals in research, so the Wildlife and Countryside Act, and similarly international treaties, CITES for the movement and transfer of endangered species, and the Nagoya Protocol is a more recent implementation here. We also use documentation. The NC3Rs produce documents that we can use into as part of our processes. And we've also touched upon the RVCS Code of Professional Conduct when looking to transfer material into the research sector. What do we need to be looking for? What permissions might we need for that? We use legal documentation between recipient and provider to really ensure that we get as much assurance as possible. But in terms of those sources that are not so straightforward, organizational policies, direct contact, asking those questions that we might need to assure ourselves of the ethical and legal collection and supply of that material. But as I say, essentially it's all to evidence the level of due diligence we feel appropriate to undertake according to that circumstance. So the first area that we'll look at is the ethical side of the review, and here I've got a list. Hopefully they're really viewable, and it's the range of questions that we ask ourselves when looking at any one situation of acquisition. They range from the reputation of the source, of the provider, through to the original purpose of the collection. Is that something we can align ourselves to? Is the conservation status an issue? Is that to do with the habitat, to do with the species? Are the activities that we wish to carry out going to be detrimental in any way? Will it in fact aid research in that area? Will it in fact aid conservation? Is it live sampling or was it post-mortem sampling? If so, was there an appropriate euthanasia policy in place? And more towards the research side of things, were the animal welfare and husbandry standards equivalent or to a standard that we'd be happy to receive from? And then, of course, the legal review, albeit shorter, can sometimes be just as difficult. We essentially look at the licensing requirements all the way through from collection sampling through to actually possessing it ourselves. And although most of those are not necessarily our responsibility as such, for example, if we're acquiring it from a third party, we want to assure ourselves that we are doing so legally. It was acquired legally, and we have evidence of that if necessary. In terms of our own requirements, for example, species that are protected within the UK may require a possession license. And so those are the sorts of things that we look at. Internationally, the restriction on purpose of use and restriction on use of data, for example, might be something that comes up as part of Nagoya Protocol compliance. So really diverse, and a lot of different scenarios require a mixture of any one of these three categories, or multiple, of course. And so, as you can imagine, we carry this out for the material that comes onto site, and the scale of that is different each week. And although we're happy that we do the absolute best that we can to assure ourselves of the provenance and of the circumstances of acquisition, as you can imagine, is it scalable? You know, can we improve on this, and can we learn? And so is it a time for a little bit of a change and a review of how we do things currently? On the left, there are some examples of the difficulties that we face. So, for example, gaps in the current guidance landscape. This is a bit more applicable to the ethical side of things, the ethical review. How do we actually do this? We're aware that a lot of organisations do, but there's a less so detail of how they do and what they really look at. What is proportionate? What is proportionate to the risk, and what is proportionate to the volume that we receive in? Obviously, each circumstances are quite unique, as I touched upon previously, and it does really lend itself to a case-by-case approach. But this does sometimes leave room for drift. You know, the nuances that we look at each scenario might not be picked up on by the researcher, and so that can be perceived as inconsistent. So where can we really pull those high-level requirements out and keep to them comfortably? So based on that, we get to transparency, and what we want to do is make sure that our researchers are fully aware of what we look at, why, and quite crucially, the positives and negatives of doing so, and the benefit to them for engaging with the process and for their research ultimately. And the ethical assessment of all the different areas, but particularly across equivalent practices. And by this, I touch on from overseas legislations, the equivalent legislations, and equivalent standards of care. How can we reach a happy compromise, a happy medium in some scenarios? Some of these are more operational. So, for example, we want to enable the science ultimately. You know, is there a risk that what we do becomes a paper exercise? What can we really pull out as a benefit? You'll note that I've put transparency twice here, and in this context, I speak more to the transparency of the sector. So, for example, suppliers, providers of material directly with some information that we would want to seek around animal welfare and things like that. We want to really promote that as a culture. It makes the process a lot easier. We, of course, want to be able to audit and report. That's really important for us, and pull out key learnings so that we move forward at each point that we do things like this. And so the opportunities that we see out of doing this review and the benefits are really to learn internally, but also across organisations and across sectors where possible. We can benchmark what we do across the sector, they say, and are we doing too much? Are we doing too little? Where can we pull similarities and pull standards so that we can create some expectations for both our researchers, our support teams across different institutes? And essentially all of this would raise awareness. You know, webinars like these raise awareness of all the different types of considerations that are sometimes missed when procuring material. And hopefully it would encourage some standardization across some of the areas that are otherwise a little bit less defined and a little bit less concrete. So ultimately, we want to keep up with the science and support them in the best way possible. And so this is kind of the prompt for the review. So to that end, we have something that we've recently begun to look at, and the Animal Materials Working Group has been recently set up to try and address these questions and hopefully aim to standardise approaches where possible. We ultimately want to raise awareness, but of course create on the ground and practical outputs that are usable to help to help aid this process within organisations. And so it's something that's pretty new. We've currently got a really great membership, but we started it before lockdown. Of course, lockdown disrupted the world. And so we've recently reinitiated it with a project scoping exercise that's currently underway. So very early stages, but something that if you would be interested in, and it would benefit your organisation, please do get in touch. But essentially, we do want to work to hopefully standardise the ethical and legal review of this type of material from all areas, you know, from procurement all the way through to in situ collections. And so some of the examples of questions that you want to ask is similar to what we touched upon previously, but the ethical questions, you know, how do we approach that? What's the methodology? A review of the current landscape, of course, to ensure that everybody is aware of all the great resources that are currently available. Are there any hard no's that we can all agree on, or will we always try to carry out due diligence in a way that works with the researcher? Can we create outputs? Is that possible? And then they can be used inter-organizationally. Can we create a framework, you know, create scenarios where we've all agreed upon certain outputs, we've all agreed upon certain approaches. And obviously, I think as a general positive to all this, it will enable networking of colleagues in this one particular area, and hopefully the scope will be defined enough that it will be really useful to those people, to the organisations, and ultimately the researchers to create a standardised approach across the scientific research sector. And as part of this, presentation, you know, I guess a question to everybody is, how can we help? How can we help other invested parties, funders, publishers to carry out their due diligence in a way that it fits in with what we've done previously or organisations have done to allow the research to go ahead. And so that really concludes what I wanted to speak about today. But thank you, and any questions?
Catherine, thank you very much. That was fascinating. Very interesting to hear what you and your organisation have been up to. It sounds very innovative. Okay, okay, our first question is, two questions. Firstly, Polly asks, how do you go about ensuring informed owner consent for material from animals treated under the Veterinary Surgeon Act?
Yes, we have had a couple of these, and they've actually both been sort of under different scenarios, and with a couple of steps removed in one situation. But essentially, what we aimed to get in the absence of a link to the owner was we reviewed the veterinary procedures and how they obtain informed consent, and we were happy that that covered our purpose. The project in particular was more actually a diagnostic research project, and that was covered in the sort of statements that the owner had signed in allowing the research, the veterinary practice to take those biopsies, because initially it was for diagnostic purposes also. So a tricky one, and we had to delve quite deep in that, but that's where we got with that one.
Thank you very much. We've had a question from, I think this is another question from the journal who publishes studies involving animals. What should happen to articles submitted to journals where research has been completed, but either necessary ethical approvals haven't been obtained or ethical concerns are raised by editors and reviewers? Should this research be rejected and results potentially wasted, or should there be some other approach?
Oh dear, that is a big question.
Yeah.
I think the topic as a whole is one of those things that can be addressed on multiple levels, with the publishing and being one of the big drivers, because obviously that is the ultimate aim for a lot of researchers, publishing and having their information, their results out there. I think as much as possible, though, it is on support for the organizational support for the researchers obviously at the start of the project or throughout, to ensure that is carried out sufficiently. In order to hopefully prevent it getting to that stage, maybe a step a step before that within the organisation, you know, and when things are going ready to publish, there could be a process around there which really prevents it coming to you with those issues. Might be something that could be taken on board by a lot of organisations. It's something that if I was approached it on a very day-to-day basis, I would work to try and obtain what we needed to do at that point in time to prevent it being an issue. But of course, it is a wider issue than that. So I appreciate the difficulty of that question.
Ms. Chandler, thank you. Okay, a couple more questions. We have a comment on resources for sharing animals tissues from Adrian. Norcopa, my apologies if I pronounced it incorrectly, the Norwegian 3Rs Resource Centre has added a list of links of resources for sharing animal tissues, so I'll put that in the chat so people can see it. And okay, would the Animal Material Working Party benefit from the addition of ethical experts to help give the correct ethical approach?
Absolutely, yes. Although I say that we have a working group membership already, we are absolutely always open to more expertise, and especially in the ethical consideration approach aspect of it. So yes, please do get in touch.
Yeah, thank you. Niger asks, how do you identify people who are using the material, say in a big academic institute, so it can be reviewed and the correct ethical considerations can be made?
Yes, I agree. It is difficult, and it's something that we employ a couple of different methods in order to do. We are quite lucky to have a centralized system that records project submission, and so we use that system to really delve into what materials might be required as part of that project. And there's a bit of an automated alert system that enables those who need to know and to follow up in due course. We also have a program system on site. So as you would have seen, we have 5 different programs, each with their own administrative teams. And so we have quite close working relationships with those teams. And we really strive to keep that working really well, because they are the people that are aware of all the research going on under their programs. And so that link is also very closely monitored. But I agree with, there is always that, what do you know that you don't know, or what don't you know? So it's very difficult.
Yeah, I mean, I think from experience that's the case, you know, not just limited to this type of research, it's limited to, I think, all types of research in all institutions. And there is, I think, correctly, a big focus on self-regulation by researchers in every field. You know, researchers are expected to know the rules of the road, know what the requirements are and how to meet them, but equally that can be tough for them to figure out on their own. So the supportive structures that you mentioned in your own institute and elsewhere are essential in any field of research to make sure researchers are able to engage in that process of self-reflection and acquisition of the necessary knowledge to know the requirements placed on them and how to meet them. And also they need to feel empowered to ask institutions for help as they often can't do this alone.
Absolutely, and it's providing the right level, the right information, what is useful and what is not just a great big document of legislation.
Oh, very much so. I mean, I think one of the reasons that Nikki and Joan and others put together the primary documents is to sort of translate, you know, some forms of guidance which perhaps aren't necessarily accessible into a short summary document, while acknowledging the wealth of in-depth information there's also out there to assist researchers in this field. Okay, we have a question from anonymous question. He said, they weren't sure if this falls under your purview, but how do you deal with studies which involve returning diseased animals into the food chain? Is this okay to do if it has ethical approval? Is this a field of study for which a type of project with which you're familiar, or?
I'm not, no, and
okay.
I wouldn't like to speculate just because I haven't got any experience with that direction. Sorry about that.
Okay, so I'm afraid a question we don't know. That's not something we feel we can answer now. If you submit a question to UK Rio via our website, we'll see if we can find a source of information on this for you. But again, if you're within a particular institution, I would say speak to your AWEB and other bodies with expertise in this area and try and get specific advice in the meantime. Okay. It's been noted that the Sangers developed a great process in identifying associated risk with acquisition of animal materials. Would it be useful to the community to share this assessment, the process that you have, perhaps in the form of a checklist or something?
Yes, and that was the real difficulty with today's presentation, actually, because although we feel like we have handled, we do feel like it can be improved with our review, and so it's something that hopefully will be the output of the working group and a little bit down the line this year. So once we can be certain, I guess, a little bit more happy with where you want to be going with it, yes, absolutely. Please do get in touch and let's chat further about it, even in the meantime, if you'd like.
Brilliant.